This video is sponsored by Craftsy. So it is not difficult to tell that I absolutely have my work cut out for me here. This really old drop leaf table was listed on Facebook Marketplace for $100, and I didn't pay $100. I offered her less, but upon seeing it in person, I probably should have offered her 20 bucks. I paid more than that, quite a bit more than that. But the point is, I saw potential in this piece in a bit of a different way than I approach most of my pieces. So there's clearly finish issues. We've got some warpage in the boards on the top. For this style of table, it is fairly sturdy still. The first thing I want to do though before I go any further with this piece is do a lead test on it. This first little tester here ended up being mostly just getting some dirt off on a couple of areas so that I would have a clean surface to test. So what you're seeing here is not color change, it's dirt. The red did have a negative test, as did the original finish, whatever it was, but this tan paint consistently in a couple of different areas did have a little bit of a pink color change. Now normally when you're testing for lead, it's a significant color change and you can tell right away. But I did 3 different samples, each one turned slightly pink, so for me that's enough to just want to get rid of this. There is a really cool sort of old patina on that red paint, but it's just too far gone, it's gotta go. I also didn't want to pass it on to someone else who may try to refinish this down the road if I kept the paint, so let's get to work. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. So again, this piece is not worth $100 in the condition that it is currently in. It is rough. It is absolutely filthy. I would not want to put a loaf of bread anywhere near this table. I knew that this piece was old, but I didn't realize how old until I really got into taking it apart and looking at the construction of the piece. My best estimate is that this is somewhere between 150 and 200 years old in that time period, and you'll see why as we go further on. I'm going to point some things out. What I meant earlier when I said that I'm approaching this a little bit differently than most of my projects, normally when I have a piece that's a little bit older, I prefer to make it look new, or at least mostly new. That is how the manufacturer would have wanted it to look. That's how it was initially made. I do embrace lumps and bumps here and there depending on the piece, but with this piece in particular, it goes against everything I normally do, but I want to keep every ding, every mark, every water stain, but the finish needs to be cleaned up. In fact, on most of this, there is no finish left. As you can see here, the hinges and the screws are completely rusted out. I had a really hard time getting all of the screws out. It took me over an hour just to take the hinges off. I had to use a ton of downward pressure just to get these to turn, and a few of them, because of the type of screw that it is, there was barely enough room to even get the head of the screwdriver in. So you'll see, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on and how that can help date this piece, and also what I do to kind of fix it to make it easier down the road. I dumped all of the hardware into a rust bath because that rust had to come off. So I'm using my favorite furniture stripper that is available to anybody, which is circa 1850. There are strippers that are more powerful, the methylene chloride ones. I prefer to use things that most people can find, and it does a really good job normally. Now, take a look at the difference here. You see how the red paint is bubbling? That weird beige paint is not bubbling, it is running. I don't know what kind of paint it is. Maybe it's a type of milk paint or something, but the fact that I had 3 questionable lead tests for it and the fact that it's behaving completely different from the red paint, I'm actually happy this is coming off. Now, what happens if you have lead paint on a piece? It's not the end of the world. A lot of people freak out and immediately put them out on the curb. The key to removing lead paint is simply to do a wet removal. So no dry removal, no scraping, no sanding. You want to get all of the paint off with a wet chemical stripper. You also want to make sure you're using gloves and eye protection, and I mean, you'll have a mask on anyway using stripper, but you just want to be extra cautious. You also want to check your local bylaws to see about removal. Now for me here, I put it into an empty paint can with a lid that seals tightly and take it to hazardous waste. On normal finishes that don't have lead present, the bylaw here states that if the stripper has dried out, it can just go in the trash. It's whatever chemicals are in it, especially the type that I'm using here, which is methylene chloride free. Somehow those chemicals are rendered inert when it's dry and I can just throw it out with the trash. It just looks like flakes of shellac, honestly. So even though there's not a lot of finish left on the bottom of the piece, I am using it here because there are some paint splatters. And it also works really well for cleaning up dirt that's caked on like this. It just cuts through much better than even a degreasing cleaner. And you can see as it dries up, all that dirt and grime just kind of comes off in these little balls. On the top, there is still a little bit of finish on parts of it. You can see it all gathering here at the corner, and you can see what color they would have used. Now, obviously, this is mixed with decades and decades of dirt, but the point is there was color added to this. But look at this grain as I'm stripping this off. I had no idea this is what the leaves look like because it was so faded and dingy and dirty you couldn't see it. This is beautiful figured wood. So that was a really nice surprise. Okay, so looking a bit at the construction of this piece, everything is put together here. You can see a little bit of old hide glue peeking out, and these dowels are pins. So everything is mortise and tenon with some glue and pins driven through them. Nothing is screwed together except for the top being screwed to the main unit and the hinges. This piece was never sanded. This is all hand scraped. It's extremely crude and rough. Here you can see at some point there was a split and someone had driven some extra pins in, which I'm going to leave as is. It's solid joint, no need to remove it. But look here, this is where the screws go in to screw on the top. Even these were done with old gouges. All of this is hand cut, hand made, hand scraped. And as such, the finish is very rough to the surface. Like there are areas that are smooth, but where you have these variations in the grain, it's a little bit rougher. You can see every mark where the person who made this carefully measured out where things were going to go. Yeah, this is the most rustic piece I've ever worked on, actually. This was not fine furniture even when it was brand new. It was completely utilitarian, and I just think that's super cool. What's also unique is that what makes up the top are not multiple boards. You've got 3 separate wide boards. The problem with this is that it's really prone to warping, and you can see these are very cupped. Now, I was skeptical doing this, and Andrea was very skeptical. She's like, this is never gonna work. It's, however many centuries old. But I had to try. So what I'm doing here is flooding the side opposite the cup with water and weighing it down with some heavy weights. Now I would flood the surface, put the weights on, let it dry, and I would come back in, I would flood the surface again, and I did this I think 4 or 5 times, and then let it completely dry overnight. And it was really funny because Andrea actually went out first before me in the morning and had a look, and she was shocked that these actually did flatten a little bit overnight. Even after being this way for, a couple hundred years. If you remember what this looked like, this was the top, so I flooded the bottom, which is going to pull it in the opposite direction. Now it's still not perfect, there's still a little bit of a cup there, but this is so much better than it was before, so I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. The reason this is important is that cupping was actually bending the hinges a little bit and putting pressure there. So having these a little bit flatter, any bit flatter, is going to help. Now I don't want to sand away any of the imperfections here. There are high spots and low spots. I don't want to lose that. All I'm doing here is just smoothing it out a little bit and preparing the surface for a dye stain that I want to use. This is a very fine grit, and you can see when I flip that over, this is the top. Those water marks, those water stains in the middle, normally I would be using oxalic acid to get those out. Again, this is a piece I'm trying something completely different and I feel is the most, for lack of a better term, respectable for the age, I guess. I feel like this piece still needs to have that history and look old, even though it's being refinished and reprotected so that it lives on even longer. As with anything, this will be debatable, but if you've been around on my channel long enough, you know that I am meticulous for details and trying to minimize damage, so you guys will know what a departure this is for me. You can see on this one side, there's a little piece of wood missing here. The only purpose that wood serves is really just hiding the hinge. It doesn't affect the movement of it. I may still fill it. I'm not 100% sure. I need to see how this looks without it being repaired, and I'll go from there. Now this is a water-based aniline dye stain. I mixed mostly French walnut color with a little bit of brown walnut, which was that one that looked super red. It always looks red when it's in pigment form, but as soon as it reacts with the water, it turns darker. So this is going to look super dark as I'm putting it on, but you'll see as I wipe it back, it's going to mellow out, and then as it dries, it's going to get very dull looking. If you've never worked with dye stains before, this can be a little alarming because you think, oh my gosh, what is this color? But the warmth that you see when it's wet, not necessarily the darkness, but the depth and the richness of it, that's what it's going to look like once you put your finish on, whatever that may be. Do you remember when I put that rusty hardware in this container with some fresh rust bath? Do you remember the color? Look at it now. Just before we get into that, I want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to Craftsy for sponsoring this video. Sponsors like this is what helps me bring videos to you a couple of times a month. Now, you may remember from a couple videos ago, I did this custom piece of art using Fusion Mineral Paint to stage with a very specific color piece that I was doing. I thought it would be fun to do that again for this table, so I'm down in my little basement craft room. You guys know I've been an artist for years in multiple mediums, but watercolor scares me a little bit, and even though I have the tools to do it, I've done, I think, 3 or 4 watercolor paintings ever, and they were small. You can see here from this tube of paint just how much I've actually used these. So I thought watercolor would be a fun thing to do for this table, but I needed to learn a little bit more about it. So I went on to Craftsy, and first I decided to read this kind of beginning tips article, read through the checklist, got my paints, got some brushes, got the right paper, I have a specific watercolor palette, check everything off, things are looking good. So now I need to learn how to actually use these paints. So I watched a few videos, but I started with this one. This seemed to be kind of a very basic beginner level thing, which is exactly what I needed. The videos on Craftsy are very well shot. They're very well edited, and I was able to just kind of lay back, relax, and watch, and even not so joined in on the learning. But Craftsy has videos on so many different subjects. You know I'm going to be checking this gluten-free cake out later. I'm definitely going to go back and watch that. Sweater weather is upon us here in Canada. If you've ever thought about learning how to knit, there are a ton of videos and classes here to get you started. And if you have a 20-minute break and you're like, I just want to learn something new, you can actually search videos by the time frame that you have, and it will populate with what is available. So really it just comes down to what you feel like learning today. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description box below will get a full year premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. That's an amazing deal, and this is for new members only. I'm not going to show you yet what I'm working on for this piece. You'll see it later in the video, but I'm all set up. I've got some basics down and I'm ready to get started. So these hinges cleaned up really well. The majority of the rust is gone. I'm just giving them a scrub and then a rinse. And you can see that although the rust is gone, which is great, they're kind of newer looking, and I don't want that. So I'm using a little bit of gun blue to help age it. Now this stuff reacts differently with different metals. Some metals it turns black. In this case, it's just darkening it, which is totally fine with me. Now, I mentioned in the beginning having difficulty getting some of the screws out, and this is why. You can see that the channel is not quite even, it's not very deep, so I'm just using a Dremel and a cutting wheel to help deepen those grooves a little bit on a couple of the screws. Here's another one that is just not formed that well. And after deepening, a little bit of gum glue helps this look old again. It's the perfect stuff for aging metal. Now, the reason these aren't formed that well is because these are at least partially handmade. In the 1800s, the majority of screws were at least partially machine-made and partially handmade. If you look at the top half here, you can see all of the individual file marks where they smoothed the metal out. Super fascinating to see something like this. It's so cool. Now the bottom is a blunt tip. This is not cut off. This was before they made pointed screws. Pointed screws came around the mid-1800s, if I'm remembering correctly. So this puts this mid-1800s or earlier. Now looking at the head on these screws was almost always hand formed, and you can see that the slot is slightly off center. This is because they did it by hand with a file, not a machine. And the grooves along the top also are parallel with the slot, again consistent with something handmade. When they started machine forming the heads, you'd have kind of a circular pattern on the top. So based on the construction of this, how crude it is, looking specifically at the screws, I can pretty comfortably say this is early 1800s, which I think is just so cool. Now I'm adding some of the Odie's super penetrating oil. This is not the typical Odie's finish. This is meant for very specific things. It's meant to bring out the clarity in the wood. It's also meant to help stabilize it. Now you might be thinking, okay, this wood is at least 300 or 400 years old probably. But those 3 top wide boards were without finish for so long, and you saw how easy it was to just add some water and some weight overnight and bend them back down. Movement is still possible. So I just thought it would be a good idea to use it as a base layer, kind of help stabilize it a little bit. Here I'm just using the Super Duper Everlasting oil, which I will then use on the tops once that first layer's had a couple of days to set in. This is what it looks like after having the Super Pen buffed off before any additional coats. We've got a lovely color, a nice soft sheen. You can see all of these beautiful age marks, scratches, dings, dents. It's so weird for me to leave these because this is not typically what I do. But this piece to me it just called for it. Look at the chatoyance in this grain here as I walk around, how it changes. It's so beautiful. After letting the super penetrating oil settle for a few days, I went and added the Odie's Super Duper Everlasting oil onto the bottoms and tops as my second layer. These are pretty big surfaces to cover, so what I'm doing is applying it with just the small pad, and then I'm going to use my sander to buff it in. Now you have to be careful with this. You can't do this with every sander, and you want to make sure that there's no vacuum attached. You don't want it trying to suck the oil up. So what I do is I put on a very small amount of oil so that all I'm really doing is moving the oil around. It's not actually soaking up into that pad. There's not enough of it. This just takes a little bit of the elbow grease out and makes things go a little faster, but you still have to remove all the excess oil by hand. Putting these hinges back on was actually pretty easy. Because each hinge is handmade, it fits perfectly in only one of these 4 slots, so it was easy to know exactly where it went. And having all the rust removed from them and the screws made this process go way faster than trying to take them off. I'm to attach the base to the tabletop now. And I'm just using a bit of wax here. My temperature is way too hot, that's why it's smoking a little bit. To fill some of the bigger nail holes. I left a lot of the smaller dings, but anything that could trap moisture or food crumbs I wanted to fill. You appear to stagger here for a second because let's look back at what this started out as. This thing was so rough, the finish was shot everywhere that there actually was finish, and places that didn't have finish, they're just an accident waiting to happen. This piece was absolutely filthy, and I know there are people that probably would like this old look and would put it in a porch and put some plants on it and call it a day, but when you have finish this damaged, this just exponentially shortens the life of these pieces. Now this thing has already lived close to 200 years. And even though it looks a whole lot better now, it's still not perfect. I made sure to leave as much of the original character and marks and war wounds, if you will, while also trying to restore the finish and preserve the life of this piece. Those table leaves that were insanely warped before, they're still warped a little bit, they're not perfect, but they do look a whole lot better than they did in that shop there. And as far as the lead paint goes, I'm glad I ended up removing it because the next person to get this, you never know, they may have wanted to take the paint off and didn't think to test for lead. So I'm glad that's gone as well. This piece was really overpriced at $100 for the condition that it was in, and even now with all of my work, the return on investment on a piece like this is not going to be that great. Sure, it's super old and it has kind of a cool history, but that history is implied. We don't know where this was made, who owned it. The value is not that high, but sentimental value, that may be different. As always, thank you so much for watching, enjoy the reveal, and I will see you next time.